what is human nature? This is the thing that's come back to again and again. Who are we? The great thing in us is the human difference, our rationality. Human flourishing is going to be a flourishing in our rationality, according to our rationality.
Welcome to the Purposeful Lab. I'm Catherine Hadro with the one and only Dr. Dan Keebler, my co-host. Hello again.
Hey, good to see you again this morning.
Good to see you. So we're on episode 5 now, and we've had previously top caliber scientists. But we're taking a different turn with this episode, and we're delving into philosophy. Why is that? Why are we taking this turn now?
Yeah, it's interesting. We in our last episode, Dr. Barr talked about sort of the limits of science, what it can and can't tell you. And so we've looked at sort of the order that you see that's inherent in the universe, the chemistry and the physics and during evolution. And then we got to man, and we saw there's something about man and his consciousness, is rationality that seems to transcend the physical. It's hard to explain it. And you know, Dr. Barr mentioned there's no equation that in which consciousness or rationality or reason fall out of. So science can tell you about the order that's there, but it can't tell you what the meaning is behind it. And for that, you have to go to philosophy, right? And to ask these deeper questions that, you know, the science brings up, but the science alone can't answer. And that's where, you know, bringing in a philosopher to look at these big questions. And we talked a little about these big questions with Dr. Barr, but that's sort of the natural progression, the questions that nature brings up to us.
Yes. And next week we'll hit on some theology as well. But for this week, philosophy, and we're really going to be examining our place in the world and what nature reveals to us about our place in the world, and really how we can learn more about ourselves by looking at nature and the order of nature as well.
Right. And that's that ties together what we've talked about at the beginning of this season, and then now the philosophy of taking a step back and what does it all mean?
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yes. So I had the privilege of interviewing Dr. John Cuddeback. He is a professor with the Department of Philosophy over at Christendom College in Front Royal, Virginia. My husband is an alum there. This was my first time I've formally met Dr. Cuddeback in person, but I've been following his work for years. He had a popular website for years called Bacon from Acorns, which has now expanded and developed to be Lifecraft, which is a project of his, which we'll get into and we'll talk about. But I first learned of him maybe like a decade ago. He did an interview with a colleague of mine really about this kind of slow food movement in response to the fast food culture that we live in, and just knowing where your food comes from and just getting back to traditional cooking. And he really lives in this kind of way that is more in tune with nature and helping people kind of get back to the classic art of the household. Yeah,
get back to nature, see where, you know, our place in nature. If you're removed from nature, like we often are living in big cities nowadays, we don't even see how we're related to the natural world, right?
Exactly. And I just know for myself too, like definitely not following the circadian rhythm when it comes to when I go to sleep and what have you. But it was a fascinating conversation. It was a great privilege to speak with him. And with that, we'll take you now to my interview with Dr. John Cuddeback. Dr. John Cuddeback, welcome to the Purposeful Lab. Thanks so much for being here.
Great to be with you, Catherine.
It's my first time being able to meet you, but my husband was a student of yours, as was one of my brother-in-laws. So hopefully they gave the Hadro name a good reputation.
Did, absolutely. But I'm expecting even better.
Dr. Cuddeback, we've had lots of great scientists, you know, on our podcast so far. You're our first philosopher. So I'd love to just ask you, what is philosophy?
All right. Well, there I'm going to go to my teachers, meaning my ancient teachers. Socrates, let's go to the word. You probably know, but we'll just remind ourselves. Philosophy comes from the Greek that means love of wisdom. So let's just go with that for a moment. A philosopher is a lover of wisdom. When you love something, you pursue it. So it's one who pursues wisdom. But what is wisdom? Well, one way that they would refer to what wisdom is its knowledge of the higher things, and then everything else in light of those higher things. Mm-hmm. So they saw wisdom as the kind of overarching knowledge. It's the one that kind of sees everything in its order. It understands what the first things are, but understanding what the first things are, that gives you an insight and appreciation of where everything else fits in, because everything always has its place. So I'd say, who becomes a philosopher? Aristotle says philosophy begins in wonder. You see these amazing things, but you want to look deeper. You want the deeper accounts. And so you keep trying to go more deeply into the reality. And the more deeply you go into the reality, they held that always brings you back to what they would call the first causes, but ultimately they also called the divine or God. So in a sense, philosophy kind of carries over into a kind of theology. And that's why often we hear those two together. But just they, as philosophers, they were lovers of wisdom. They pursued wisdom. And there are many things that come under that, but they appreciate all other kinds of knowledge also as being relevant to what they do.
And, you know, we've been asking big questions throughout this season so far, season 1 of the Purposeful Lab. Why does anything exist? How did the universe come to be? Is there any meaning or direction in that? You're an expert in Aristotle, I would say. How did Aristotle think about these big questions?
Well, expert in Aristotle is a very big thing to say. I'm a student of Aristotle, and I have read him quite a bit, and I love him very much, and I've learned a lot from him. So I'll share what I think he sees when he looks at the universe. In this way, he was with certain Greeks, and he stood out from Greeks. You know, they say everything was said by one Greek or another. And so, you know, there's not some uniform view of those Greeks, but he's very much in a tradition of Socrates, Plato. What did they see? They saw order. They saw goodness. They saw that things are extremely well arranged. And so through that, they definitely came to conviction there's something very great behind the universe, behind the cosmos, behind this ordered whole. And they had absolute confidence that it was a mind. It was an intellect. And why? Because everything is so well ordered. And where could order come from but from something that is intellectual? We could say the word even personal. That wasn't a word that they would have used. So, just from the start, the universe, the cosmos is just chock full of meaning. It's anything but random. It's rooted in higher causes, ultimately one cause. And there's so much for us to discover of richness about its origin. We're never going to understand it in their view completely, but there's so much to discover.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to delving more into that. Aristotle is often regarded as the first scientist as well. In his observations when it comes to the natural world, what were some examples of order that you're speaking about now that Aristotle encountered that really illustrates, again, this model of an ordered universe?
Yeah. Well, Catherine, one of the interesting things about Aristotle's whole view is he was both kind of philosopher and scientist at the time. They didn't really make a distinction between that. He was interested in understanding everything. And given his interest, I'd say, most of all, on coming to the higher things, that made him very interested in what we might call the lower things, because he always saw hierarchy. And when you see hierarchy, that doesn't take away from the lower things. It just puts them in their place in the whole. So part of the reason he was so interested in studying very closely the things that you and I would associate with, say, physics or biology, is because he had this conviction that all of these things are showing forth the causes that are behind them. So ultimately, he does say, I'd rather know a little bit of the higher things than a whole lot about the lower things. But to come to that knowledge of the higher things, he was all about studying those lower ones. So I'll give you an example. You asked for an example. And here really comes the aspect of order. When he asked the great question, does nature act for an end? This is what we call the issue of teleology, which comes from the Greek word that means end or order to the end. So he's saying, does nature act for an end? An example he loves to bring up is the structure of teeth in animals. And so he just says, look at the mouth of an animal. Look at the structure of the teeth. Let's just say the fox. He doesn't choose a particular animal. And say, though recognized, if we just see it, one thing that's obviously true about it is the way the teeth of a fox are arranged is absolutely perfect for its eating, indeed exactly what it needs. So we ask the question, is this accidental? Did this just happen to happen? Or was this somehow purposive? Right? Is there an order to an end there? And obviously there he's pointing in the direction of clearly there's some kind of, you could use this word, kind of a design. There has to be some kind of ultimate intellect behind it because there's such an order in the mouth. You could just say an order among the teeth, then expand that out. That order itself is connected to a certain order of how the fox lives. So there's just a little angle into that.
And again, just one example of the fox, but you see that repeated with all the different animals.
You do indeed. And you could go to something like, the shape of the leaf of the oak tree. Right? I mean, just get in there into the minute detail. It's perfectly suited to what the oak does. So you can just go on and on.
You already mentioned a hierarchy and how Aristotle viewed things in a hierarchy, and he organized nature in that. Can you expand on that? And then where did humanity fall into place in that hierarchy?
Yeah, I love this aspect. Well, going back to the point of, and when Aristotle looks at the cosmos, he sees the Greek word nous, kind of intellect, mind. Clearly, I mean, let's put it this way. He was so aware of this. There's a whole set of things that clearly are not the product of the human intellect. They're just given. Right? I mean, think how, the human intellect, we have to work really hard just to understand basic things about what a tree is and how it acts. This is so far from coming up with the idea of tree. Right? So there must be some intellect that's moving on a very different plane that would be behind the richness of all these things. So again, he sees mind. There's mind behind everything. But then this, of course, is the angle from which we see our unique place in the cosmos, because we too have nous, N-O-U-S. We too have mind or intellect, and that is he would literally say a kind of kinship with the divine. That absolutely sets us apart. Those amazing foxes with their teeth, those amazing oak trees that do these things that are truly wondrous. But here we are at a different level. We're able to use our mind to grasp these things and to appreciate these things. So Aristotle is profoundly aware of the human difference and the human nobility, especially rooted in our being intellectual, which clearly connects us to the first cause behind everything.
No, that absolutely makes sense. As we're discussing now, really man's place in the universe, and again, kind of you really contextualized it there with that hierarchy. I want to talk about human flourishing. And what did Aristotle mean when he spoke about flourishing?
Great. Okay, so here we go. I want to say the big notion, the big idea, term, you need a good term to capture an idea in Aristotle, at least in the top several, is the notion of nature. And so, and that things have a nature, these things that exist by nature, they're these various natural kinds, right? And so when you look at them, each thing, according to its kind, this is just part of what we notice. And again, I just want to say this about Aristotle. He's such an archetype of a wise man, of a lover of wisdom. He's always docile to reality. The wise man always wants to see what's there. He doesn't come and try to tell nature what it is. He recognizes what's there. So one of the first things we notice through Aristotle's eyes about the natural world, or through our own eyes, is how according to their kinds, natural things have a way of kind of more fully becoming themselves, or to use the term you asked with, flourishing.
Right.
So all natural things, according to their kind, you can say have this way of becoming more themselves. This is most obvious in any living thing. And again, we go back to the notion of order. Think of a grain, a plant of grain. First, you have the blade. Then you have the ear. Then you have the kernel. there's an amazing order there, an amazing progression, and it's moving towards more becoming itself. And you can say it's moving towards a flourishing. So flourishing is kind of a full exercise of itself, a term, use a technical term that Aristotle would use. Natural things by what they are have various potentials or potentialities. Their flourishing is when they really fulfill that. So you asked about, and I'm glad you did, I mean, in the natural world, what are we going to be most interested in? Human nature.
Right, ourselves.
And so then we're gonna ask, with that kind of docility, we look at what is human nature. This is the thing that's come back to again and again. Who are we? Yeah. What are we? This is a lifelong search to simply understand, we might say, the great gift of what it is to be ourselves. Well, we noticed earlier, the great thing to notice is the human difference, our rationality. So for starters, for Aristotle, human flourishing is going to be a flourishing in our rationality, according to our rationality. So just if I throw one more thing at you then there, Catherine, that I really love, there's kind of two aspects of rational flourishing according to Aristotle. One is to use your reason well to grasp the way things are. Clearly, we want to know the causes of things. We want to know what's going on out there. But then also, and here we come into the moral realm, to use our reason well to guide our action. So the whole realm of ethics is something that Aristotle is so known for, and you can kind of cast it as using your reason well to discover what it is to be human, and then to act that out according to what is clearly a beautiful plan of what it is to be human.
Wow. So if I'm understanding this correctly, we as humans, we will flourish. We will be most fully ourselves and really most fully alive when we use the gift of our intellect and rationale.
Yes. You know, I think I'd say one of the great lies of our age is that you more become yourself, like find yourself by just doing anything you want, kind of just being creative in a vacuum, rather than, there's a place for creativity. There's always a kernel of truth. There's a place for creativity according to our rationality, but creativity in the context of there's a nature here. I'm going to say a natural plan. And this is talk about things we can learn by looking at those lower things. That there's a given way that trees are going to flourish. There's a given way that animals are going to flourish. By what they are, there's certain ways of acting that are going to fit with what they are. And it's just as true of us. It's just as true of us in human life. Do we have the docility to recognize there's a kind of plan for human living? I'm not saying a plan that comes down to, well, what street you're going to live on. Plan in the basic aspects of what a good human life looked like. That's written into human nature, and we can use our reason to discover it.
And in fact, we probably should be, right? We all probably are called and have a responsibility to observe around us and apply that to ourselves.
Amen. And you know how I think Aristotle would put that? He'd say the end, the flourishing is the end, the goal, the flourishing. It's due, D-U-E. Clearly written into nature is that we're inclining towards that. That's what we're for. To not go with that, to not follow that, to not discover that, he might not use the term, it's to reject a gift. But I have absolute confidence that he'd be very much on a wavelength of that. But he always had this sense of wonder about how beautiful it is to be human, how it's such a gift to have our place in the cosmos, to be able to learn so much about ourselves by looking at these lower things, to be able to look to the lower, and then likewise to turn to the higher. To not do this would be such a shame. This is so beyond just kind of the issue of what makes for survival or not. This is an issue of it's written into us, into a kind of wisdom in the cosmos that we can become wise. And that's fitting. And to not do that, we'd say something is lacking that should have happened.
To get out of ourselves actually helps ourselves
Yes.
too,
Yes.
to observe the, like you said, those below and above in the cosmos.
Amen.
Just expanding on this point even more, how do we then investigate and continue to discover our own conditions that are necessary for flourishing as human beings? And is the path to flourishing different for us than other things in the natural world around us?
Well, good question. Two good questions. The path is different, but when we're trying to understand things, we always need to see where there's sameness and then also where there's difference. So we have something in common with those other natural things. So there's the commonality of, as it were, act according to what we are. Mm-hmm. But then there's the difference. Then there's the human difference. And so this is why there's a whole separate science for the wise called ethics, because it's the science of how we put right order into our life, which you and I may or may not do, right? Part of the drama that he's very aware of, he doesn't use the word freedom a lot, but he's very aware that we're free. It's in our power. Will we discover this order and act according to it or not? So there's the great drama going along with the human difference, is that we may or may not do this, right? I mean, there's a little teeny drama, maybe say, in like, will the fox make it? Right? And I mean, there you can kind of watch the story of the fox, but there's none of that deeper drama of, will the fox choose to enact what the fox is? We humans, with this, the human difference, it's so dramatic. Again, look around in the world today. We can just say no. We can just say, we don't like this, the way nature has kind of made things, so we're going to redo this. We're going to pretend we have the power. And this is the funny thing. In some sense, we are free to do that, but it's a freedom that is actually a rejection of ourselves.
It seems like freedom and order have to go together.
Amen.
Whereas
Amen.
again,
Yes.
that we tend to receive different messages. That freedom, no,
Good.
There's no order, no rules.
Right. And another way, Catherine, I think we could even connect that is to say, real freedom always has to be rooted in truth. If you try to enact freedom just in a vacuum where anything goes, you will have chaos. And dare I say, I think one of the most ugly instances of chaos in the cosmos is the human life gone really badly, in the sense of chosen badly, right? Just kind of freely having said, no, I'm not going to recognize that there's certain ways of acting that I'm called upon to do, right? That's an ugliness and a shame that is so profound. And this is some great stories. This is what, when you look at the movies that are most popular, right? You see this in Star Wars, right? Or whatever it is, kind of the drama of, will you choose according to the good or not? There's the human drama, there's ethics, and this comes back to all these issues of, is there a nature? Is there an order in nature in the cosmos or not?
I want to make this even more applicable down to the individual that I think people will be really interested in. What are some even more examples of principles found in nature that give us lessons on how we as individuals can flourish?
Yeah. Well, I mean, how about this? One of the main things that nature is speaking to us about is family life. I'm a bird watcher. So this morning I was watching the bluebirds that are nesting in the box that my father and I made together. I mean, bluebirds enact, a big part of bluebird nature is every spring, they do the same thing. They make a nest, they raise their young. If a snake comes and eats their babies, which is not something that's gone terribly wrong in the great big picture, I think they look a little downtrodden, but I think I'm projecting. They start over. They just start over. And they're acting according to a plan. There again, that's not like you're going to run out and praise them. Way to go, bluebirds! Like you're so amazing. Although there is something kind of amazing.
Yeah.
But family life is one of the main ways that nature's calling us. I'm going to say to generosity. I mean, this is one of the beautiful things. And you mentioned earlier, kind of getting outside of ourselves. Yeah. The order of nature is extremely challenging and noble, we need to take care of one another. We're part of a community. We have to be generous. Here I naturally find myself falling in love with a young lady, wanting to get married. Boom. But look what naturally goes along with that. What naturally would come from that, despite what people might say in kind of turning away from it, is children.
Yeah.
Right? But children are going to demand a lot from me. And a big part of my living a good human life is, am I going to be willing to do right by my spouse and do right by my children? Moving into level, is there a similarity with the bluebirds? There is, but there's so much different. There's so much richness. So much of life is in, will I accept that challenge to be generous in that particular way? Now, if it's not that way, then I'm going to be called to be generous in another way.
And you mentioned earlier, flourishing is being most fully ourselves. So are we most fully ourselves when we're giving of ourselves?
Amen. And this is the thing. This is where, again, it's so funny, Catherine, the sameness and then the difference. There's parenting in animals. Again, and maybe that's part of, because of the likeness with what we do. We love watching those bluebirds. But then for a man, what better is kind of the archetype of human flourishing than a father? A father who is generously living according to what obviously is a plan he didn't make up. Again, to go back to our basic principles we've been talking about, that we look at the cosmos and recognize in there an order that's part of it, that's given in there that we can discover. Men becoming fathers, women becoming mothers. I'm not saying that's the only way to human flourishing, but it is obviously so central a way of flourishing, right? Kind of receiving that gift.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And you really have been equipping families with more tools with your project, Lifecraft, which I'd love to hear more about. Lifecraft is described as a community project about discovering and applying natural wisdom in today's challenging context, with special attention to issues relating to households, friendship, work, and stewardship. I'd love to hear more about this. Tell us about your goals with Lifecraft and why did you start this?
Well, thanks for asking. Catherine, it came of teaching at Christendom College. I have these great students that are just so interested to, study Aristotle, among others, and just to see the way that these kind of fundamental natural principles, natural insights can change people's lives. There's just so much there that when we see the kind of universal principle, when our mind starts to grasp that, it moves our heart. And we have a sense of, oh my goodness, yes, this is for me. We recognize something of ourselves, of our nature, when we start to study these things. So I want to bring that to a wider audience. And so the principle is, discover the plan. The natural plan is always better than we've yet realized. I am absolutely confident of that. Aristotle was confident of that. And I'll say, honestly, as a Christian, I'm even more confident of it because I recognize that behind this natural plan is this even fuller plan of this God who loves me. But my area being philosophy, I love to just kind of dig into what are the basic principles, especially about friendship, relationships, about life in a home, about the natural, ordinary things, relationship to the lower things in nature, because that's obviously part of human nature. We need them. That's part of the plan, is that we interact with them. I'll even use the word steward them. So to try to bring good philosophy, I put it this way: give people the encouragement that they need to say yes. These maybe sometimes these traditional things that we thought we should do, there's a good reason to do them.
Would you say that just our modern day lifestyle and the grind, here we are in, the city right now, and the grind of daily life and just being removed from nature around us, do you think that's caused our society and ourselves to be out of sync with our natural design and purpose?
I do. And it's not as though I'd claim it's only that, but I really do think, and you see this, human nature is always the same, and it will always be speaking to us. And you see it coming out in people having the sense of they feel like they've been too much separated from the natural world. But often people aren't sure what to do. Or do I just go and hug a tree? I mean, and sometimes you get an environmentalism that might be, well-intentioned, but kind of missing the human difference. And so nature's speaking to us. We need to have that connection. I'm absolutely convinced. Christians use this language of God gave us two books. He gave us the book of Scripture. He also gave us the book of nature. And Aristotle was kind of a master in reading the book of nature. We need to read that book. When we close that book to ourselves, by always being on our device, by always being bound up in our own technology and the things we've made, artifacts, what Aristotle would call them, which have their place and they're great. But there's this kind of primary importance of the natural things that always is where we go back to kind of remind ourselves of who we are. So yes, it does make a difference.
Yeah. And I mean, I know I'm guilty of that too, of often treating my body like a machine and input, output.
Yes.
Instead of living in, I think, the healthy rhythm that we are designed to. One of Lifecraft's areas of exploitation is stewardship. And I love that you said you claim being a natural steward can help us, again, to become most truly ourselves, that point again. What is stewardship and how is it important for flourishing today?
So that's a great question. Stewardship is always a kind of caring. Stewardship is always someone looking beyond themselves. Anyone who's selfish will never be a steward. So stewardship is always a taking care. And I say taking care in a way that's willing to look beyond your own good. But in this amazing way, when we steward the things that are given to our care, we more become ourselves. So there's all these different levels of stewardship. Normally when we use the term steward, we're referring to kind of the natural world. You could say that parents have a kind of stewardship towards their children, right? But one of the main ways we use it is towards the natural world. And here I kind of go back to Aristotle. You know what he says about us and our relationship with food? He says clearly it's a natural plan that we interact with nature in meaningful ways so as to feed ourselves. The only way that we're going to be fed is by interacting in certain ways with nature. And so it's kind of, there's a plan that we should care for nature and interact with it. And Aristotle would go this far, and again, Christianity would bring this out even more. It's a plan that is good on multi-levels. That's always the thing about nature. The plan always has aspects of it we didn't realize. We feed ourselves in body, but by taking good care of, for instance, the plants in my garden, this is good for my soul too. It cultivates in my soul a kind of sense of caring for things, a kind of patience, a kind of perseverance. We could talk about all the virtues that, for instance, good gardening cultivates in us. So this is why I love to do that in helping people, encouraging people on what to do in their household. The household is a natural place to interact in a meaningful, caring way with the natural world. And we all can benefit from that.
And I'm thinking, is that our place and the hierarchy of things to be a steward and care for?
Indeed. And it's part of our being higher, but not in this kind of lorded over as though I would just do from me anyway. So I take care of them. They're lower than me, but they're a gift for me that I have to take care of.
Just further on that point, what are some more practical guidelines that we can use if we want to look and examine our own lives and ask, are we being our truest self? I really think that this conversation probably sparked a lot of interest in our listeners right now. And if they're asking, am I being my truest self? What are some guidelines, especially if we want to make some changes?
Well, okay. How about first I'll say 30,000 feet, the approach that we've already been kind of sounding here. Begin with humility, docility. What is the plan that's written into my nature that when I discover it and live it out, this is going to help me become more who I am? And this includes a lot of those difficult things. Many of the most controversial things of our day, people go immediately to sexual ethics and all the no's involved there. I love to point out, in the realm of sexual ethics and marriage and family life, any no is always for the sake of a yes. There's always so many rich goods here. But be willing to recognize one of the things that nature is telling us is restraint, discipline, put order into our desires. this isn't really popular to talk about, but the traditional virtues, of temperance, chastity, or restraint in the realm of eating. These are a way of putting a certain order into our desires, in order so that the fuller flourishing can come out. So I'd say be attentive and recognize that things, moral obligations, moral norms are always for our good. It's always to empower us to become more who we are. So I think that those are kind of the most important ones. And then go out from the moral norms to things just like, and here I go, the richness of the household. Getting in touch with kind of the natural things, raising your own food, preparing food, sitting around the fire, storytelling, the kind of more natural ways that we're together as families. These things are part of this good life. They're connected with the moral norms. So there's just a few areas I'd go.
No, that's really helpful. And again, each person's plan is unique and different, but there is still something overarching that we can learn from nature. I want to give you the last word, Dr. Cuddeback. Just any final thoughts that you want to share with our viewers and listeners as we think about our place in the cosmos and what we can learn from nature and what it reveals about us.
Thanks for asking. Gratitude. It's sometimes it's hard to be grateful, especially sometimes when we suffer. And the human condition is always going to have a lot of suffering. And it's the suffering that can make us wonder, is this really a good plan? I think we come to an incredibly special moment when we're able to see even through the parts that are hard, even through the suffering. Wait a second. No, this plan actually still is great. It is a gift. So I'd say couragio, courage, gratitude. Receive the gift. Live according to the gift, and it's always going to be better than we could have imagined.
Dr. John Cuddeback, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
It really was such an honor to speak with Dr. Cuddeback and hear what he had to say. What stood out to you from that conversation?
There were so many things that stood out to me. I could probably go on for a half hour, and I would have loved to been part of that interview, talk to him. There's so many things there to draw out. I think one of the things as a scientist that really struck me was his discussion of teleology. Like, what is the end of things? What's the purpose of humans? What's the purpose of the cosmos, right? And it's interesting. Modern science has sort of cut itself off from that question. So modern science, that's a question that it doesn't answer, it doesn't address. It just wants to know the material causes and efficient causes of things. How does this thing work? How's it put together, and so forth? Rather than asking that question, does the universe have a goal or purpose? What's the purpose of the human life, right? And so a lot of scientists, because they don't talk about those questions, because those are not things that modern science asks, say, well, there isn't a purpose, or there isn't an end for these things. And I think, that's a problem, because that's a real question, right? And he says that we need to follow, human flourishing is following our intellect and using that to its proper sort of ends, right? And that's a question that our intellect keeps coming back to over and over again throughout the millennia. All great thinkers always are asking, what's this for? What's the meaning of life? What am I here for? What's the purpose of the cosmos? And that's a real question. The cosmos either has a purpose or it doesn't. I have a purpose, you have a purpose, or we don't. And that's a question that we as humans need to answer, even though science alone, as he makes the point, can't answer that question.
Right. It shows kind of the limits of the science there and really the gift of philosophy. And so I love that we're able to weave in science, philosophy, theology, and what have you. Another point that he made was just talking about human flourishing. We really flourish within the context of family.
Yeah.
What stood out to you there?
Yeah, it's interesting because he talks about what can we learn from nature, right? And about family. So if you look at humans, one of the things that's striking about humans compared to other primates is when babies are born, their brain is still developing, right? And it develops for a longer period of time. So humans take much longer to reach adulthood than other primates. So that means there has to be a lot more parental investment in these sort of helpless creatures than when they're born. And that sort of, it resonates with this idea of fatherhood and the need for fatherhood, right? The having a mother and a father coming together in a community, coming together to take care of the children, to put more parental involvement. You can't just have one person doing that you need a father and a mother. And then, just looking at the psychology, like we know the importance of fathers from, the problems with people in terms of mental health when they don't have a father there, or the father doesn't do what the father is supposed to do. So, I think science, as we look at nature and in that way, we see that it resonates with the need for being good fathers as part of human flourishing, right? It doesn't, being a good father doesn't contradict what we know from biology and from science. It actually sort of makes sense as we look through what nature shows us.
I'd love to just kind of ask you a follow-up to that. You're a father of 6. When you became a father, did you find that you were becoming more of yourself?
I think what I found, and I think a lot of fathers will say this, you recognize your need for growth. And you realize, I always thought I was a patient person until I had a kid. Then I'm like, oh my God, I'm the most impatient person. And you realize how much you have to give to become the person you're meant to be, right? When you're wrapped up in sort of your own needs before you have kids, you are much more blind, I think, to some of your weaknesses and what you need to grow and what you need to be, at least in my experience.
Lots of opportunity for virtue within the home. And that kind of feeds into another thing he said about the importance of docility and how we as humans need to lean into that as well.
Yeah, and that's what it's interesting. One of the virtues that makes a good scientist is that docility and humility to nature, like learning from nature, and how he talked about how Aristotle, as a scientist, although they didn't make those distinctions back in the ancient world, but he came to nature to learn from nature, wanted nature he wanted to read nature without bias. And we all have biases, and it's hard to, but to come with the humility and docility to learn from it so that then we can make sense of that.
And really just to have that, maintain that position of awe and wonder, and to be outside of ourselves.
Right. And all rather than control. I'm going to control nature. I want nature to come out this way to show that it supports my philosophical beliefs or theological beliefs. But no, I'm docile, open to nature. And the questions, the meta questions, the philosophical questions nature is going to pose back to us, that we are all philosophers to a certain extent, because we all have that sense of wonder or that sense of curiosity, that we want to know.
And seeking that truth. And this episode and this conversation really teed us up perfectly for next week's, which is the finale of season 1. I can't believe that, today we discussed the hierarchy in nature and man's place in that. And next week we'll be looking at the different levels of happiness and how to measure that as well.
Yeah, so that gets us, right to, we talked today, what do you learn from nature? Now, how do you flourish? And we'll talk about, the flourishing and happiness, again, dealing with, the ancients, ancient philosophers and what they talked about with happiness.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that conversation next week then as well. All right, that brings us to the office hours segment of this episode. I saw this news headline and I thought, Dr. Keebler will be able to answer this. But I'm mystified by this. Listen to this recent headline. Scientists find crocodile virgin birth at Costa Rica Zoo. That's right. According to a study published in the journal Biology Letters, scientists have documented the first known instance of a virgin birth by a crocodile, which has been living in isolation for 16 years at a zoo in Costa Rica. Okay, you are an expert in evolution. We've discussed evolution in this podcast already. What does this mean and how is it possible?
Yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon. It's quite rare. It's called parthenogenesis. So what happens is that during the development of eggs, oocytes in women, you have an egg, and then you have 3 sort of what are called polar bodies, which are small cells that usually get discarded, but they have half of the DNA. And so you have an egg that's got half the DNA. And what happens in this parthenogenesis is one of these polar bodies fertilizes, quote unquote, the egg. And so, you get a full complement of genetic material from the mother. So there's no sperm involved. And parthenogenesis occurs in some organisms. It seems to be relatively rare. You see it in, it's not only in, this is the first time they found it
Right.
in crocodiles, but you see it in some birds, you see it in some snakes and salamanders. It's relatively rare. There's some evidence that it's more common in species that have a sort of a low density. So if you're a species that has a hard time finding a mate because there's fewer around, here's another way to reproduce. The interesting thing about this is that the baby was stillborn. So the fact that you're losing genetic diversity. So when you have a sperm and egg, you get more genetic diversity. But when you're sort of self-fertilizing through this parthenogenesis,
it's not as healthy.
Not as healthy. But they be the trade-off evolutionarily is it allows you to survive if your species is endangered to be able to do this. So it's interesting. The headline though they use virgin birth.
Right.
And so does this happen in mammals? Does this happen in humans? Does this explain the virgin birth? It's interesting. This hasn't ever been documented in mammals, and it's probably unlikely to happen in mammals. It's really interesting. Sort of a mystery of biology. There's different theories of why, but in mammals you have this thing called imprinting. So what that is like there's certain genes that are turned off in the sperm and are only on in the egg. And there's other genes that are turned off in the egg and are only turned on in the sperm.
Like what?
So there's genes that regulate growth. So there's one that regulates it's IGF. It regulates the growth of cells and cell division. And it's not clear why, but that if an egg sort of self-fertilizes, it's got genes that are turned off, and you need to have the sperm to turn them on. So you wouldn't get proper development. So it seems like you have these what are called imprinted genes in mammals that seems to make this parthenogenesis impossible, at least in mammals.
Right.
And so this is not, here's an explanation of the virgin birth. But it's interesting how certain groups, like in crocodiles and reptiles, they don't have these as much of this imprinting, so they're able to do this. Although, it's not as if that's their main means of reproduction.
Right.
Yeah, it's not the best way to go about things.
I was going to say, you said this is rare that this happens, but why would it happen? Just to propagate the next generation?
Yeah, that's
an
interesting question. Some people think it's it's evolutionarily ancient, and so some of these like lizards and snakes have maintained this ability, but it's called facultative, meaning that they don't do it all the time, but they have the ability to do it under certain conditions. And so in snakes you see where they do both sexual reproduction and some parthenogenesis in a few species. Wow. So it seems like they can do both almost at the same time. But again, it's rare because, in a challenging environment, it's better to have more genetic diversity and not just reproduce, the same genes from the mother over and over again.
Well, thanks for helping to demystify that headline. That caught my attention. And you actually flagged this for me. There's these new trials happening. So there's this blood disorder called alpha thalassemia, which reduces the production of hemoglobin. And typically when you get that blood disorder diagnosis, it's fatal. But now there are these clinical trials testing whether a child in utero can be cured from this before they are even born. So can you tell us about this trial and its significance?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So this is a blood disorder, alpha thalassemia. So, your red blood cells have a molecule, hemoglobin, that carries oxygen and transports oxygen. And so you have different hemoglobins that are expressed, some in the embryo, some at the fetal stage, and some at the adult stage. And in alpha thalassemia, the ones that are turned on in the fetus don't work properly. And so normally the baby will die because it's not getting enough oxygen, right? You're not transporting oxygen. Yeah. So what they had started to do is to treat this with blood transfusions in utero. So in utero, they could transfuse blood, insert red blood cells through the umbilical cord. They do this a couple times, and then the baby can be born. And then you continue doing transfusions throughout the baby's throughout the life. To keep replacing red blood cells like once a month or so the person can live. That allows them to survive, but it's not a cure. And so what they thought, well, maybe we can replace the stem cells in the bone marrow that produce red blood cells. So in your bone marrow right now, you're making tons of red blood cells. It's the main cell that's being produced in all of us all the time because you need so many of them, and they only last 2 to 3 months, so they die, and you got to keep replenishing them. So if we can take some stem cells and put it into the baby in utero, maybe those stem cells, these healthy ones from another person, could make the proper red blood cells with the proper hemoglobin. The problem often is, though, the baby would reject foreign cells. But then, interesting thing between the mother and the baby, there's there's cells that go back and forth across the placenta. It's a very amazing sort of organ. This where they share cells, and it's interesting. Some of the cells of the babies are found in the mother, years later. It's really interesting. But the baby actually develops tolerance to the mother's cells. So you can take, and what they did in this trial is take some of the bone marrow cells from the mother and purified the stem cells and injected those in utero into the babies in utero. It didn't cure them, it didn't work, but it's a very interesting study. And they think, well, maybe now that they've got these babies, they can tolerate the mother's cells. Maybe they can try it when they're 2, 3, 4, and give them even more cells. Maybe they need to have more stem cells. But it's a very interesting way of trying to use the mother cells to cure the issue with the baby.
Well, and it's just, kind of blows my mind about how much we can treat a patient still in utero. And I feel like science and medicine are really advancing more and more to do so. Yeah,
no, it really is. And these are all, treatments that have come about in the last, this one is brand new, but these blood transfusions have become more commonplace in the last 20 years. And now there's more fetal surgeries that are, for people with babies with spina bifida, which is where the spinal cord doesn't develop properly. If it's severe, they can do some surgeries to correct that in utero, and they can do surgeries for a couple other things as well. So there's more and more medicine being dedicated to helping address these problems in utero, which is wonderful, because often, unfortunately, is the case. People are, a baby's diagnosed with spina bifida, they want to have an abortion. So for people that are think that they want to do that, here's another option to help treat the baby in utero, which is wonderful.
The youngest patients there is. Well, you can always answer my questions. So thank you so much, Dr. Keebler. And if you have questions that you want to send to Dr. Dan Keebler and see him answer them here at the office hours segment of the podcast, head on over to the Magis Center website. You can find out everything about the Purposeful Lab, see all our episodes. So make sure to head on over there. And again, as always, make sure to subscribe, and we'll see you here next week.